The dust from Preston Rawley's boots hadn't even settled on the church steps when Margaret Sullivan lifted her skirts and ran. Her white dress disappearing into the Colorado afternoon like a ghost fleeing daylight. And that was the first time his heart learned what it meant to shatter in front of an entire town. Preston stood there in his best Sunday suit, the one he'd bought special from Denver, watching the woman he'd courted for 8 months vanish down Main Street with his dreams trailing behind her like tin cans on a wedding carriage. The reverend cleared his throat. His mother sobbed into her handkerchief. The townspeople of Fort Bridger, Wyoming whispered behind their hands, and Preston felt something inside him crack clean through. He was 24 years old, and he'd just been made a fool. That was 1876, and Fort Bridger was still rough around the edges, a trading post turned settlement where the Oregon Trail split, and men came to start over. Preston had thought he'd found his fresh start with Margaret, but she'd had other ideas. Word reached him 2 weeks later that she'd boarded a stage to San Francisco with a gambler she'd met at the saloon. Preston told himself he was better off, that a woman who'd run wasn't worth mourning, but the shame stuck to him like tar. He threw himself into his work at the livery stable he owned with his brother, shoeing horses and repairing wagons until his hands bled and his back ached. The physical pain was easier to bear than the other kind. His mother stopped mentioning grandchildren. His friends stopped asking about courting. Life went on the way it does in a frontier town, with seasons changing and cattle moving and people coming and going like tumbleweeds. Then came Sarah Winters in the spring of 1878. She arrived on the eastbound stage with carpet bags and a smile that made Preston forget his name for half a second. She was a school teacher from Ohio, come to educate the children of Fort Bridger, and she had honey-colored hair and a laugh that sounded like music. Preston met her when she brought her trunks to be stored at the livery, and within a week, he was finding excuses to walk past the schoolhouse. Sarah was different from Margaret. She was steady and kind, and she talked about the future like it was something real and tangible, not just a dream that might blow away. They courted proper for 1.5 years, with church socials and Sunday dinners and long walks along the creek. Preston's mother started planning again. His friends clapped him on the back. The reverend smiled knowingly when they reserved the church for October 1879. Preston should have seen the signs. Sarah grew distant that summer, her smiles forced, her touches hesitant. But he'd wanted so badly to believe that this time would be different, that this time he'd get his happy ending, that he ignored the way she flinched when he took her hand, the way she changed the subject whenever he mentioned the wedding. October came with golden aspens and crisp mountain air. Preston stood at the altar in the same church, wearing the same suit he'd bought in Denver 3 years prior. The guests filed in, more hesitant this time, whispering less but watching more. The reverend took his place. The pianist played, and Preston waited. He waited while the sun moved across the stained glass windows. He waited while his collar grew damp with sweat despite the autumn chill. He waited until his brother finally came through the side door, his face pale and his eyes full of pity. "She's gone, Preston. Left a note at the boarding house. Says she can't go through with it. Says she's in love with someone else." The someone else turned out to be a surveyor from the railroad company, a man who'd been boarding at the same house as Sarah all summer. They'd left together on the morning train, heading east before the ceremony could start. Sarah hadn't even had the courage to face him. This time, Preston didn't wait for the whispers to start. He walked out of that church with his head high and his heart in pieces, and he made himself a promise. Never again. He was done with love, done with trusting, done with standing at altars waiting for women who wouldn't show. He was 27 years old, and he was finished with hoping. The years crawled by like wounded animals. Preston worked, he ate, he slept. He spoke when spoken to and smiled when politeness demanded it, but inside he'd gone cold as a January creek. His mother worried. His friends gave up. The town stopped expecting anything from him except good work on their horses and fair prices on hay. Fort Bridger grew around him. The railroad brought more people, more businesses, more opportunity. The wild edge softened some, though you could still get shot for looking at a man wrong in the saloons on Friday nights. Preston watched it all from a distance, like he was seeing life through a frosted window, present but not participating. Then came the telegram in April of 1882. Preston was shoeing a mare when his brother Samuel brought it to the stable, waving the yellow paper like a flag of surrender. "You're not going to believe this," Samuel said, his eyes wide. The telegram was from a lawyer in Cheyenne. It concerned a Miss Beatrice Lawson, age 24, currently residing in Illinois. She was, according to the cramped typewritten words, Preston's mail-order bride. "I didn't order any bride," Preston said flatly. "Ma did," Samuel admitted, looking sheepish. "She's been corresponding with a matrimonial service. She didn't think you'd agree if she asked, so she just arranged it." Preston felt anger flare hot in his chest, the first real emotion he'd felt in months. "She had no right. I know. But the girl's already on her way, been traveling for a week. She'll be here on tomorrow's stage." Preston wanted to send her right back. He wanted to march to his mother's house and unleash the fury he'd been holding in for years. But he did neither. Instead, he finished shoeing the mare, washed up, and went home to his small cabin at the edge of town to stare at the ceiling all night, dreading the morning. The stage arrived at 2 in the afternoon, dust clouds announcing it before the horses came into view. Preston stood outside the livery with his arms crossed, jaw tight, ready to explain to this Miss Beatrice Lawson that there'd been a terrible mistake and he'd pay for her return trip, and his apologies for his meddling mother. The stage door opened. A woman stepped out and Preston's prepared speech died on his tongue. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional way. Her face was too angular, her frame too thin, her brown hair pulled back severe under a simple bonnet. But her eyes, when they met his across the dusty street, were the clearest blue he'd ever seen, and they were filled with something he recognized because he'd felt it himself. Fear, hope, desperation, the look of someone who'd gambled everything on a single chance. She walked toward him carrying a single worn carpetbag, her dress patched but clean, her chin raised despite the trembling of her hands. When she stopped in front of him, she didn't smile or simper or bat her eyelashes. She just looked at him with those impossible blue eyes and said, "I'm Beatrice Lawson. I assume you're Preston Rawley. I know this isn't what you wanted. Your mother's letters were very kind, but I can tell by your face that you didn't know about any of this. If you want me to leave, I understand. But I need you to know that I came here honestly. I'm not trying to trap you or trick you. I'm just trying to survive." Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes, and Preston felt something shift in his chest, like ice beginning to crack. "You better come inside," he said, not kindly but not cruelly either. "We need to talk." They sat in the office of the livery stable, the smell of horses and leather thick in the air. Beatrice perched on the edge of a wooden chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Preston leaned against the desk, studying her. "Tell me why you're here," he said. "The truth." Beatrice took a breath. "I'm a widow. My husband died 2 years ago in a factory accident in Chicago. We'd only been married 6 months. His family blamed me, said I'd brought bad luck. They took everything, even though legally some of it should have been mine. I had nothing. I worked in a textile mill for a year, but the pay was barely enough to keep me fed and the conditions were difficult. When I saw the advertisement for your mother's matrimonial service, it seemed like a chance for something better. I know that sounds mercenary, but I'm being honest. I'm not in love with you. I don't know you. But I thought maybe we could build something together, something stable. I'm a hard worker. I can cook and clean and keep house. I can read and write and do sums. I'm not asking for romance. I'm just asking for a chance at a decent life. Preston appreciated the honesty even as it confirmed his worst suspicions. Another woman who wanted something from him, even if it was just security instead of love. But there was something in the way she held herself, proud despite her circumstances, that made him pause. "I've been left at the altar twice," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "I'm not inclined to trust women who make promises." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Twice? That's terrible. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just understand that I'm not the man your letters described. My mother romanticized things. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not looking for anything except to be left alone to do my work and live my life." "Then, why haven't you sent me away yet?" Beatrice asked quietly. Preston didn't have an answer for that. He should have put her right back on that stage, should have handed her money for the return trip and apologized and closed the door on this whole mess. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she'd been honest with him when she could have lied. Maybe it was the quiet desperation in her voice that matched something in his own soul. Maybe he was just tired of being angry. "I'll make you a deal," he said slowly. "Stay for a month. I'll pay you wages like I would a housekeeper. You can stay in my cabin. I'll bunk with my brother. At the end of the month, if you want to stay, we'll talk about making it permanent. If you want to leave, I'll pay your way to anywhere you want to go. No obligations either way." Beatrice studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "That's fair, thank you." They shook hands like business partners, and Preston tried not to notice how small and cold her fingers were in his, how they trembled just slightly before she pulled away. The first week was awkward as a three-legged dog. Preston showed Beatrice to his cabin, a small, sturdy structure he'd built himself with 2 rooms and a fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was clean and solid. Beatrice walked through it slowly, her fingers trailing over the rough-hewn furniture, the simple dishes on the shelves. "It's nice," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. Preston left her there and went to stay with Samuel, who ribbed him mercilessly about the situation. "Ma's going to be impossible now," Samuel laughed. "She'll think she's a matchmaker." "Nothing's been matched," Preston said gruffly. "It's a business arrangement." But even as he said it, he found himself thinking about Beatrice, about the patches on her dress and the worn handle of her carpetbag, about the way she'd held her head high even when asking for help, about the fear and hope mixed in those blue eyes. He saw her around town over the next few days. She bought supplies at the general store with the money he'd given her. She attended church on Sunday, sitting alone in the back pew. She walked to the creek to wash clothes, her arms full of his shirts and trousers. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for anything. She just quietly went about the business of living. Preston found excuses to stop by the cabin, to check if the roof needed repairs, to bring more firewood, to drop off fresh meat from a deer Samuel had shot. Each time, Beatrice thanked him politely and offered him coffee, which he declined. Each time, he noticed something new. The way she'd organized his cluttered shelves, the way she'd mended a tear in his curtain, the smell of bread baking in his oven. On the 8th day, he came by in the evening and found her sitting on the porch steps, her face streaked with tears. Preston froze. He was terrible with crying women. He never knew what to say, what to do. But something about the way Beatrice was trying to hide her face, wiping roughly at her cheeks, made him sit down beside her. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Nothing. I'm fine. I'm sorry, I should not be crying." "You're crying anyway. Might as well tell me why." Beatrice laughed, a wet, broken sound. "It's stupid. I got a letter from my sister today. She's getting married in June to a man who loves her. And I'm happy for her, I truly am. But I just realized that I'll never have that. I'll never have someone look at me the way her fiancé looks at her. I'll never have a marriage that's about love instead of survival. And that's fine, I made my choice, but tonight it just feels lonely," Preston finished quietly. "Yes, lonely." They sat there in silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Preston thought about Margaret running away in her white dress, about Sarah leaving him standing at the altar, about the cold, hollow years since, about loneliness. "I know what that feels like," he said finally. "Being lonely even when you're surrounded by people, feeling like you're on the outside of something everyone else has." Beatrice looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time Preston felt like someone was actually seeing him instead of just seeing his disappointments. "Why did they leave?" she asked softly. "The women who were supposed to marry you." Preston had never talked about it, not really. He deflected questions, changed subjects, buried it all under work and silence. But something about the darkness and the quiet and the way Beatrice had been honest with him made the words come. He told her about Margaret and the gambler, about Sarah and the surveyor, about standing in that church twice, feeling foolish and broken, about the promise he'd made to himself to never trust again, about the years of going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. When he finished, Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "They were fools, both of them. Not because you're perfect or because they made the wrong choice for themselves, but because they were cowards. If they didn't want to marry you, they should have had the courage to say so before they let it get that far. What they did was cruel and you didn't deserve it." Something in Preston's chest loosened, something he hadn't even realized was clenched tight. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. "I won't do that to you," Beatrice said suddenly, turning to face him. "I can't promise that I'm the right person for you or that this will work. But I promise that I'll be honest. If I want to leave, I'll tell you to your face. I won't run and I won't hide and I won't make you stand anywhere waiting for me. You deserve at least that much respect." Preston looked at her in the fading light, at the tear stains on her cheeks and the determination in her eyes, and felt something shift inside him. Not love, not yet, but something. A crack in the ice, a possibility. "I appreciate that," he said. "And I promise you the same. Honesty. No matter what." They shook hands again, but this time it felt different, like they were making a real promise instead of just a business deal. The second week, things changed. Preston started staying for the coffee Beatrice offered. They'd sit at his small kitchen table, drinking from chipped mugs, talking about small things. The weather, the town gossip, a funny incident at the livery. Beatrice told him about growing up in Illinois, about her parents who died of fever when she was young, about her sister who'd raised her. Preston told her about building the livery with Samuel, about their father who died in a mining accident, about their mother who meant well but meddled too much. The conversations were easy in a way Preston hadn't expected. Beatrice didn't simper or flirt. She just talked to him like a person, asking questions and listening to answers and sharing her own thoughts. She was smart and funny in a dry way that caught him off guard, making him laugh when he'd forgotten he knew how. He started teaching her about horses, showing her how to approach them without spooking them, how to read their moods. Beatrice was a natural, her touch gentle but confident. She wasn't afraid of the big animals, and they seemed to sense it, nickering softly when she came near. "You're good at this," Preston said one afternoon, watching her stroke the nose of a temperamental stallion that usually bit strangers. "I like them," Beatrice said simply. "They're honest. If they don't like you, they let you know. If they do like you, same thing, there's no pretense." Preston thought about that for a long time. They fell into a routine. Preston worked at the livery during the day while Beatrice kept house and started helping some of the neighbor women with sewing work to earn her own money. They ate dinner together most evenings, sitting on the porch when the weather was nice, talking until the stars came out. Preston moved back into his cabin, sleeping in his own bed while Beatrice took the small back room. It felt natural, like they were figuring out how to exist in the same space without crowding each other. The third week, Preston's mother came calling. He'd been avoiding her since Beatrice arrived, still angry about the matchmaking scheme. But Martha Rawley was not a woman to be avoided indefinitely. She showed up at the cabin on a Tuesday morning with a basket of preserves and a determined expression. "Preston James Rawley, you will not keep avoiding me," she announced, marching into the cabin like she owned it. "I want to meet my future daughter-in-law properly." "Ma, we've talked about this," Preston started, but Beatrice appeared from the back room, wiping flour from her hands. "Mrs. Rawley," she said calmly, "it's nice to meet you. I'm Beatrice." Martha stopped short, clearly expecting either hostility or fawning gratitude. Beatrice offered neither. She simply smiled politely and invited Martha to sit, offering tea like a proper hostess. Preston watched warily as the two women circled each other with words, Martha probing with questions about family and background and plans, Beatrice answering honestly but revealing little. It was like watching two chess players, each trying to figure out the other's strategy. Finally, Martha set down her teacup and looked at her son. "I owe you an apology," she said, and Preston nearly fell over in shock. Martha Rawley never apologized. "I shouldn't have arranged this without telling you. I just wanted so badly for you to be happy to have someone. But that was my desire, not yours, and I had no right to meddle in your life like that." Preston softened despite himself. "I know you meant well, Ma, but you can't fix everything." "No, I suppose I can't." Martha looked at Beatrice. "What I can do is tell you that you're welcome in this family, whether you end up marrying my stubborn son or not. If you need anything, you come to me. Understood?" Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, and Preston realized that she probably hadn't had anyone say something like that to her in a very long time. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." After Martha left, Beatrice excused herself to the back room. Preston heard her crying softly and wanted to go to her to comfort her somehow, but he didn't know how. He'd forgotten how to be gentle with anyone, including himself. Instead, he made more coffee and waited until she came out, her eyes red but her composure restored. "Sorry about my mother," he said. "Don't be. She's wonderful. You're lucky to have her." Preston thought about that, about family, about the things that tied people together beyond blood, about the strange situation they were in, pretending to be something they weren't while slowly becoming something neither of them had expected. The fourth week arrived too quickly. Preston realized with a jolt that the month was almost over, and he had no idea what he wanted to happen next. The thought of Beatrice leaving created a hollow feeling in his chest that he didn't want to examine too closely. But the thought of asking her to stay, of making this real, terrified him. What if she said yes and then changed her mind? What if they got married and she realized she'd made a mistake? What if he let himself care and she left anyway, like all the others? Beatrice seemed to sense his turmoil. She gave him space, going about her days quietly, not pushing. But there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a resignation that made Preston ache. On the 28th day, A stranger rode into town. He was well dressed, riding a fine horse, and he asked around for Beatrice Lawson. Preston heard about it from 3 different people before noon, each one more excited than the last about the mysterious gentleman looking for the mail-order bride. Preston found them talking in front of the general store. The man was young and handsome, with slicked back hair and an expensive suit. He was smiling at Beatrice like she was the answer to his prayers. "Beatrice, please just hear me out," the man was saying. "I know I have no right to ask, but I've come all this way." "What's going on here?" Preston demanded, his voice harder than he'd intended. Beatrice looked relieved to see him. "Preston, this is James Hartford. He's from Chicago. We worked at the same factory." "I've loved her for 2 years," James said earnestly, turning to Preston. "I know she came here to marry you, and I respect that. But I couldn't let her go without telling her how I feel. Beatrice, I can give you everything: a house in the city, fine clothes, security, love. Please come back to Chicago with me. Marry me instead." Preston felt like he'd been kicked by a horse. This was it. This was the moment. Another woman about to choose someone else, about to leave him standing alone while she rode off toward a better future. History repeating itself in the cruelest possible way. But Beatrice wasn't looking at James Hartford with love or longing. She was looking at him with something that might have been pity. "James, I'm flattered, truly, but I don't love you. I never gave you any indication that I did. We barely spoke when we worked together. I know, but we could learn to love each other. I could make you happy." "I'm sure you could make someone very happy, but not me." Beatrice turned to Preston, and her eyes were clear and certain. "I'm sorry. I should have sent him away immediately. This is my fault." "You don't have to apologize," Preston said, his voice strange to his own ears. "If you want to go with him, you should go. He can offer you more than I can." "I don't want more," Beatrice said softly. "I want what I have here if you'll still have me." Preston stared at her. The words didn't make sense. She was choosing him over this wealthy, handsome man who'd traveled hundreds of miles to declare his love. "Why?" he asked, the question raw and vulnerable. "Because when I'm with you, I don't feel lonely anymore," Beatrice said simply. "Because you make me laugh. Because you taught me about horses, and you listen when I talk, and you don't expect me to be anything other than who I am. Because I think we could build something good together, you and I. Not a perfect fairy tale, but something real and solid and true. Because I want to stay." Preston's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He looked at this woman who'd arrived a month ago as a stranger, who'd crept into his life with her honesty and her quiet strength and her clear blue eyes. He thought about the conversations over coffee, the shared silences, the way she fit into his days like she'd always been there. And he realized with startling clarity that somewhere along the way, without his permission or intention, he'd started to fall in love with her. "I want you to stay too," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "Not as a housekeeper. Not as part of a business arrangement. Stay because you want to. Stay and marry me. Stay and let me try to make you happy. I can't promise I'll be perfect at it. I'm rusty at this whole thing. But I promise I'll try." Beatrice's face transformed with a smile that could have lit up the whole Wyoming territory. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." James Hartford sputtered protests, but neither of them were listening anymore. Preston pulled Beatrice into his arms right there on Main Street in front of God and everybody, and he kissed her like a man who'd been drowning and just found air. She kissed him back with the same desperate hope, her hands fisting in his shirt, and Preston felt something he'd thought was dead forever spark back to life in his chest. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Beatrice was crying and laughing at the same time. "I was so scared you were going to send me away," she admitted. "I didn't know how to tell you that I'd fallen in love with you. You love me. Preston asked, needing to hear it again. "I love you," Beatrice confirmed. "I think I started falling the night we talked on the porch. I just didn't know it yet." "I love you too," Preston said, and the words felt like coming home. "I think I've been falling for weeks, but I was too scared to admit it." James Hartford eventually left in a huff, and the townspeople had enough gossip to last them through winter. Preston didn't care. He walked Beatrice back to the cabin with his arm around her waist, both of them grinning like fools. They were married a week later in the same church where Preston had been left waiting twice before. This time, there were no doubts. This time, when Preston stood at that altar, he did so with absolute certainty. And when Beatrice walked down the aisle in a simple blue dress with wildflowers in her hair, her eyes locked on his, he knew with bone-deep conviction that she would reach him, that she wouldn't run. That this time, finally, it was real. Beatrice's hand in his was warm and solid as they spoke their vows. Her voice didn't waver when she promised to love and cherish him. And when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with all the joy and relief and love that had been building in his heart, and he heard the congregation actually cheer. After the ceremony, at the celebration at his mother's house, Samuel pulled him aside. "You look different," his brother said. "Happy." "I am," Preston admitted. "I really am. She showed up for you. That's what you needed. Someone who'd actually show up." Preston looked across the room at Beatrice, who was laughing at something Martha was saying, her face glowing with happiness. "Yeah," he said softly. "She showed up, and she made me believe again." The first year of their marriage was the happiest of Preston's life. Beatrice moved into the cabin fully, making it a home in ways it had never been before. She sewed curtains for the windows and planted a garden out back. She helped at the livery when they were busy, her way with horses proving invaluable. She became friends with the women in town, especially Emma Cartwright, the doctor's wife, who taught her how to preserve the abundant vegetables from the garden. Preston found himself coming home early just to be with her, to sit on the porch and talk about their days, to hold her hand and marvel at the fact that she'd chosen him. They made love with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies and souls with equal attention. Preston discovered that Beatrice liked to be kissed on the curve of her neck, that she hummed while she cooked, that she talked in her sleep sometimes about nothing in particular. Beatrice learned that Preston was ticklish behind his knees, that he had nightmares sometimes about being left alone, that he showed love through actions more than words. She learned to read his moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed closeness. She learned that underneath the gruff exterior was a man with a tender heart who'd been hurt too many times. They had their disagreements, of course. Preston could be stubborn and closed off when something was bothering him. Beatrice could be too proud to ask for help even when she needed it. But they learned to talk things through, to apologize when they were wrong, to choose each other even when it was hard. In the spring of 1883, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She told Preston one evening after dinner, her voice nervous and excited all at once. Preston felt fear and joy collide in his chest so hard he couldn't breathe for a moment. A child. He was going to be a father. "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked anxiously, misreading his silence. Preston pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but yes. I'm so happy I don't have words for it." The pregnancy was difficult. Beatrice was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down. Preston hovered anxiously, bringing her water and cool cloths and whatever she thought she might be able to eat. Martha came by daily to help, and Preston found himself grateful for his mother's meddling nature. She knew exactly what to do, exactly what to say to ease Beatrice's discomfort and his worry. As Beatrice's belly grew round with their child, Preston found himself touching it constantly, awed by the life growing inside her. He talked to the baby, telling it stories about horses in Wyoming and how much its mother was loved. Beatrice would laugh and run her fingers through his hair, her eyes soft with love. The baby came in December during a snowstorm that blanketed Fort Bridger in white. Emma Cartwright and Martha attended the birth while Preston paced holes in Samuel's floor, terrified something would go wrong. When he finally heard the baby's cries strong and loud, he nearly collapsed with relief. "It's a boy," Martha announced, appearing in the doorway with tears on her cheeks. "A healthy, beautiful boy, and Beatrice is fine. She's asking for you." Preston rushed into the bedroom to find Beatrice exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with such love in her eyes that Preston felt his throat close with emotion. "Meet your son," she said softly. Preston took the baby with trembling hands, staring down at the small red face, the tiny fingers curled into fists. His son. His and Beatrice's son. The proof of their love made flesh. "He's perfect," Preston whispered. "Just like his mother." They named him Thomas Samuel Rawley, after Preston's father and brother. Thomas grew into a cheerful baby with his mother's blue eyes and his father's dark hair. Preston was amazed by how much love he could feel for someone so small, how his heart could expand to hold this new person without diminishing what he felt for Beatrice. If anything, watching her with their son made him love her more. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, first smiles and tiny hands grabbing fingers. Preston cut back his hours at the livery to be home more, to help Beatrice, to not miss a moment of Thomas growing. Samuel stepped up to cover for him, teasing him mercilessly about being soft but clearly delighted to be an uncle. When Thomas was 6 months old, Beatrice's sister Catherine came to visit from Illinois with her new husband. Catherine was younger than Beatrice, with the same blue eyes but a rounder, softer face. She fell in love with baby Thomas immediately, spending hours holding him and cooing at him. One night after dinner, Catherine pulled Beatrice aside. Preston overheard them talking through the open window as he sat on the porch. "You seem truly happy," Catherine said. "I was so worried when you told me you were marrying a stranger, but he's good to you, isn't he? You love him." "More than I thought possible," Beatrice answered, her voice thick with emotion. "I came here looking for survival, and I found everything I never knew I needed. Preston is the best man I've ever known. He's kind and strong and so full of love, even though he was hurt so badly before. He makes me feel safe. He makes me feel cherished. I can't imagine my life without him now." Preston sat in the darkness, listening to his wife describe their life together, and felt tears on his cheeks for the first time since he was a child. This was what he'd been waiting for all those years. Not the big romantic gestures or the perfect wedding. Just this. Someone who loved him truly, who showed up every day, who chose him over and over again. He went inside and found Beatrice, pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply while Catherine laughed and excused herself. "I heard you," Preston said against her lips. "What you told your sister." "Oh," Beatrice said, blushing, "I meant every word." "I know you did. That's why it matters. Beatrice, you changed my life. You made me believe in love again when I thought that part of me was dead. You showed up for me. You stayed. You gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Beatrice said, tears streaming down her face. "A home, a family, love, safety. You." They held each other in the lamplight of their small cabin, their baby sleeping peacefully in the next room, and Preston felt complete in a way he'd never imagined possible. The years spun out like thread on a loom, weaving a life rich with meaning and joy. Thomas grew into a sturdy little boy who loved horses like his father, and had his mother's gentle way with animals. Preston taught him to ride before he was 4, tiny hands gripping the reins while Preston walked beside him, ready to catch him if he fell. In 1886, Beatrice gave birth to twin daughters, Rose and Lily, who had their father's dark hair and filled the cabin with twice the noise and twice the love. Preston learned to braid hair and tell stories about princesses alongside his stories about horses. He learned that little girls could wrap a man around their fingers faster than any rope could bind a steer. The livery prospered. Preston and Samuel expanded, buying the property next door and adding more stalls, hiring help. Beatrice kept the books, her neat handwriting tracking every dollar, her sharp mind catching errors before they became problems. They were partners in every sense of the word, building a life together one day at a time. Fort Bridger continued to grow. The railroad brought more commerce, more people. The town got a proper school and a new church. Preston served on the town council for a few years, using his reputation as a fair and honest businessman to help mediate disputes. Beatrice became known for her charity work, organizing collections for families in need, teaching women to read at the church on Sunday afternoons. They watched Thomas grow into a thoughtful young man who wanted to be a veterinarian. They watched Rose develop her mother's fierce intelligence and Lily develop her father's quiet strength. They had arguments and makeups, sick children and sleepless nights, lean years and prosperous ones. They had life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. On their 10th anniversary in 1892, Preston took Beatrice back to the church where they'd married. It was evening, the building empty and quiet. They stood at the altar where he'd once waited in fear and heartbreak, and he took her hands in his. "I want to renew our vows," he said. "I want to stand here with you and choose you all over again, like I've done every day for 10 years. Beatrice was crying, but she was smiling too. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want that too." So they spoke their promises to each other again, older and more weathered than the young people who'd stood there a decade before, but so much richer in love and understanding. Preston promised to cherish her, to support her, to choose her every day for as long as he lived. Beatrice promised the same, her voice strong and sure. When they kissed, sealing their renewed commitment, Preston thought about the journey that had brought them here. About Margaret running away and Sarah leaving him at the altar. About the pain and loneliness that had nearly broken him. About his mother's meddling that had brought Beatrice into his life. About the scared, desperate woman who'd stepped off that stage 8 years ago with nothing but hope and courage. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips. "For what?" Beatrice asked. "For showing up. For staying. For making me believe that love was possible again. For giving me everything." "You gave me everything first," Beatrice said. "You gave me a chance when you had every reason not to. You opened your heart even though it had been shattered. You loved me when I didn't think I deserved to be loved. Thank you for that. Thank you for us." They walked home hand in hand through the twilight, their children waiting for them with a cake Martha had helped them bake. The cabin was warm with lamplight and laughter, filled with the sounds of family and love and home. Preston looked around at his life, at the wife he adored and the children they'd created together, at the solid walls of the cabin he'd built, and the town they'd helped grow, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what had been waiting for him all along, beyond the heartbreak and disappointment. This was what he'd been meant to find. The years continued their steady march. Thomas went off to Denver to study veterinary medicine in 1896, making his parents proud beyond measure. He came home summers to help at the livery, bringing new knowledge about animal care that improved their business. Rose showed a talent for music, her voice clear and beautiful in the church choir. Lily developed a passion for horses that rivaled her father's, spending every spare moment at the stable. In 1898, Preston turned 45 and Beatrice turned 40. They celebrated together with a party that Martha organized, surrounded by friends and family and neighbors. Preston gave a toast that night, standing in his mother's packed parlor with Beatrice beside him. 20 years ago, I thought my life was over, he said, his voice carrying across the room. I'd been hurt and disappointed, and I'd convinced myself that love wasn't meant for me. Then a woman stepped off a stage with one worn carpetbag and changed everything. Beatrice, you showed up when I needed you most. You stayed when it would have been easier to leave. You loved me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. You gave me a family and a home and a reason to believe in happy endings. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day. Beatrice was crying openly, and so were half the women in the room. She stood and kissed him in front of everyone, not caring who saw, and Preston held her close, marveling once again at the gift of her presence in his life. As the new century approached, Fort Bridger continued to modernize. Electricity came to town in 1899, and Preston had the cabin wired, though Beatrice still preferred oil lamps for the softer light. Automobiles started appearing on the streets, though Preston remained loyal to his horses. The wild edge of the West was fading, replaced by something more settled and civilized, but some things remained constant. Preston still woke each morning with Beatrice beside him, still felt that surge of gratitude that she was there. They still talked over coffee in the mornings and held hands on the porch in the evenings. They still chose each other, day after day, year after year. In 1902, Thomas returned to Fort Bridger permanently, opening a veterinary practice in partnership with his father's livery. He'd met a young woman in Denver, a teacher named Grace, and they married that fall in the same church where his parents had wed. Preston watched his son take those vows and remembered his own wedding day, the fear and joy and hope all mixed together. Rose married in 1904, a banker's son from Cheyenne who adored her and promised Preston he'd spend his life making her happy. Lily surprised everyone by remaining unmarried, declaring she was going to run the livery after her father retired and didn't need a husband to have a fulfilling life. Preston supported her, proud of her independence and strength. The grandchildren started arriving. Thomas and Grace had a daughter in 1903, a son in 1905. Rose had twin boys in 1906. The cabin that had once held just Preston and Beatrice now rang with the sounds of children and grandchildren, multiple generations gathering for Sunday dinners and holidays. Martha passed peacefully in her sleep in 1908 at the age of 75. Preston mourned his mother deeply, but he was grateful she'd lived long enough to see her family thrive, to know her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. At her funeral, he thanked her publicly for meddling in his life all those years ago, for bringing Beatrice to him even when he'd been too stubborn to accept help. Samuel nodded in agreement, tears on his weathered cheeks. Preston and Beatrice grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down. Preston's hands grew stiff with arthritis, making shoeing horses difficult. Beatrice's eyes weakened, making her intricate sewing harder. But they adapted, supporting each other through the changes, finding new ways to be useful and engaged with life. They traveled some in those later years, taking the train to San Francisco to see the ocean, to Denver to visit galleries and theaters, to places they'd only read about. But they always came home to Fort Bridger, to the cabin that held their history, to the town that had witnessed their love story. On a warm summer evening in 1912, Preston and Beatrice sat on their porch watching the sunset. Preston was 60, Beatrice was 54. They'd been married for 30 years, together for longer. Preston's hand in hers was spotted with age, but the grip was still firm, still warm, still home. "You ever think about how we started?" Beatrice asked, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "How scared we both were. How it was just supposed to be a business arrangement." Preston smiled. "I think about it all the time. I think about you stepping off that stage looking terrified and determined all at once. I think about how I planned to send you away and couldn't quite make myself do it. I think about how you chose me over James Hartford, over security and wealth and a man who claimed to love you. I think about how lucky I am that my mother meddled and you needed a fresh start and we found each other against all odds." "I'm the lucky one," Beatrice said. "You could have closed your heart completely after what happened to you. You could have sent me away that first day. Instead, you gave me a chance. You let me in. You taught me what real love looks like. Not the romantic fantasy from novels, but the daily choice to show up for each other, to be honest, to build something together. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, Preston Rawley. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." Preston kissed her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I love you too. More than words can say. You showed up for me, Beatrice. When 2 other women couldn't, you did. You stayed and you loved me and you made me believe that I was worth loving. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home, a family, a purpose. You." They sat there as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, the mountains standing eternal in the distance, the sounds of Fort Bridger settling in for the night around them. Their children were grown and happy. Their grandchildren were healthy and thriving. The life they'd built together was solid and good and filled with love. Preston thought about the scared, broken man he'd been in 1882, standing at that altar for the second time with his heart in pieces, promising himself he'd never trust again. He thought about how wrong he'd been, how close he'd come to missing all of this because of fear. He thought about the woman beside him who'd had the courage to take a chance on a stranger, who'd shown up and stayed and loved him into wholeness. "Thank you," he said again, like he'd said 1,000 times over the years. Beatrice squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she echoed. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Preston Rawley sat with his wife of 30 years and knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The heartbreak of the past had led him here, to this moment, to this woman, to this life. He'd been left at the altar twice before her, but Beatrice had shown up. She'd shown up and stayed and loved him, and in doing so, she'd finally made him believe in love, believe in second chances, believe in happy endings that were real and lasting and true. Believe that he deserved to be happy, to be loved, to have all of this. And as Preston kissed his wife under the Wyoming stars, surrounded by the life they'd built together, he sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for every moment, every choice, every day that had brought him here, to her, to home.